Hey everyone, my name is Rooster and welcome back to Mechabellum. In today's video I want to talk about defense. Now I know that for some of you the very idea of having to deal with an aggressive push is very daunting, and so I hope that with today's video I could give you the game plan and the tools necessary to deal with this a bit more easily next time you have to face an aggro player. For those of you that haven't seen my previous video on aggro, I highly do recommend you take a quick look at it, as it does explain kind of the main ideas and the main play styles involved with aggressive play, and understanding this will help you know how to defend, right? I will reiterate this as well so that we briefly have an idea of what aggro is, what are their strengths, and also then what are their weaknesses so we can exploit it when we try to defend. So what is aggro? Generally it's going to be a play style that plays forward in front of their towers. And one of the first things it tries to leverage is the fact that the towers are worth 9 seconds of debuff if they manage to take them down. So if they manage to take down one of your towers, they are very likely to win a round. And that means they will do damage to you. If they can repeat that process across multiple rounds, then they are likely to win the game. That is one. The second is that some units, some starting units and some units you can buy, benefit more from being close to your opponent. Reason being is that they may have a very low base range. So here I've built a certain board that you might face, where there are Wraith and Steel Balls involved, right? And both of these units have a very low base range. And so in order to make sure to draw out basically what they're good at, minimizing the range between them and you will benefit their comp. Right, so that is kind of the second main reason why someone might play aggro. This also means that if you are facing certain starting units, you should probably think about already kind of positioning in a defensive manner so that you don't get caught off guard if you do happen to face a push. These units again are going to be indeed Steel Balls and also things like Tarantulas. Tarantulas have a low base range too, and they are quite tanky, so they like using that tankiness on the front lines. Now, the main thing that you have to be scared of, or not scared of, but the main thing that I'm going to be talking about here is how to defend against asymmetrical aggro. The reason for this is that asymmetrical aggro is the one that has the most tempo, right? The one that is the most oppressive because it uses leverage in the fact that all of their units on round one are going to be on one side, whereas your units are probably going to be more symmetrically positioned on the board. So this gives them an advantage from the get-go, and you will have to try and stabilize during the game. Of course, you can also face things like symmetrical aggro, but symmetrical aggro doesn't have that advantage of having additional units on one side of the board. And so what I'm going to be talking about is going to apply equally to things like symmetrical aggro, but that type of push is not as scary per se. So this is kind of one of their strengths, right? They are going to be mainly on one side of the board, and that gives them an advantage in trying to take the tower on that side. Now, what they have to give up for this, though, is the fact that the rest of their board doesn't have that many units. Mainly, their flanks are going to be quite open, and one tower here is going to remain relatively exposed for at least the first couple rounds of the game. And you can make use of this, and I'll talk about this more in the kind of tips and tricks section that's going to come later on. Another thing that is kind of a weakness is the fact that they are on the line, and so it's much more difficult to protect themselves adequately from certain spells. For one, you can't shield on the enemy board. So putting down spells on in this area is going to be quite effective, and I'll talk about that as well. And defending against missiles is slightly more difficult. So these are kind of the strengths and benefits of an aggro player. Now, when you are facing, or when you think you'll be facing an aggro player, how do you set up? Generally speaking, I would recommend that you set up in the middle of the board. The reason for this is that you don't know, for one, if your opponent is going to be pushing, and then secondly, you don't know if they're going to be asymmetrically pushing on the left, on the right, or pushing symmetrically. You just don't know, right? Putting your units in the middle will allow you to set up a board in the rounds following that will be able to react to this much better. And the reason for this is that if your units are in the middle of the board, they'll be able to move to the correct side of the board no matter where the opponent is. If, say, you were to position on the outsides, then one of your unit packs is indeed going to be on the correct side, but the other pack is kind of going to be isolated and making a push for this tower. Obviously, the opponent towers are also worth 9 seconds of debuff, but it's very likely that your units are going to arrive there when the fight is already over, and especially when the rounds progress and this tower might get leveled by the opponent, this is simply going to hurt you. So generally speaking, I would recommend positioning on the inside of the turrets. Another thing, obviously, is that you'll want to be in front of your towers. You want to protect them. And there are kind of two ways to go about this. You can play a little bit further back, or you could try and play more in the middle. The benefit of playing all the way up front in the middle is going to be that it's going to pull units more effectively and prevent them from going to the tower at all. But in the rounds following, it is much more vulnerable to things like beacon plays, since your units will be quite far removed from that pack, right? So generally speaking, I would recommend you position your units around here. I'll show this in some replays as well. Now, let's talk kind of about some positioning tricks, right, from round 1, basically. Something that you can do in this game is if you have a unit pack and you position it 5 squares in front of the tower and 2 squares to the inside, it will still pull all of the enemy units on their board. So it doesn't matter if it's like a pack of crawlers all the way in the back. It doesn't matter if it's like this Wraith and Steel Ball pack all the way on the left side of the board. They will get pulled to this pack of Fangs instead of getting pulled to the tower. Obviously, they can beacon around that in later rounds, but for a round 1 setup, this is quite useful. And this is definitely something that you should try and use, and I will showcase that in the games I play as well. This is something I use a lot. A second thing that you might want to try is positioning units vertically. One is going to be vertical Fangs. Fangs are much better at defense generally, or at least on the front lines, because they have range and they're relatively slow, so they tend to hold their position a bit better, which allows for better funneling of units. And then the second unit that you might want to use here is going to be vertical sledgehammers. This is especially the case against things like Steel Balls, Typhoons, Wraith as well. This is going to be very, very useful as a unit to kind of put a halt to their advance. And the reason for this is that vertical sledgehammers, aside from staggering their attacks onto chaff, also are much, much more difficult to kill for something like Steel Balls. And the reason for that is that Steel Balls obviously have ramping damage, and so the damage at the start of the ramp up is really bad, and the DPS at the end is very good. If you use vertical sledgehammers, all of the Steel Balls will lock onto the same sledge, have to kill it with the bad portion of the DPS, and then once they finally killed it, they have to then reset and restart the ramping. So it takes much, much longer. And we can have a quick look at that as well. Let me set that up. All right, so here we are. I'm quickly going to push the start button. So one thing you will see is all of these units here on the left are indeed getting pulled by the Fang pack. And on the right, you can see the difference between vertical sledges and horizontal sledges. The horizontal sledges have already all died, and the vertical ones are still alive, right? This kind of showcases some of the tactics that you can use against the most prevalent aggro strats. So with that out of the way then, how do you want to progress, right, your composition? You've kind of got your round 1 positioning. I'll show examples of this as well later on. How do you want to position units or buy units in rounds 2, 3, 4, 5? Now you should generally be in the middle from the get-go, and then from that point onwards, you're going to start building onto the side that you're getting pushed, right? Again, here I'm talking about asymmetrical aggro mostly. With symmetrical aggro, you should be under a little bit less pressure, so you should be able to build a more symmetrical board. But if you're against asymmetrical aggro, you're going to want to expand onto the side that you're getting pushed on. What this means is that generally you're going to want to have your pack in the middle that deals with the advance coming from the middle, and then you're going to have a bunch of units that are kind of over here that can deal with a deep flank, a shallow flank, and the units coming from this diagonal. Now, the way that you can set this up, if we're using the example of sledgehammers again, is that you can put some sledgehammers, let's say about 3 to 4 squares here on the left side of the turret, and then have 2 of them that are basically on this line. So these will turn if you ever get flanked, and they'll help out the units that you might have here in the back, like a Farseer or a Phoenix, some Mustangs, whatever it is that you want to put there. And then the other ones will still be able to travel forwards and put a stop to this diagonal push before it can get to your tower. Another unit that you can use sometimes is going to be like a Vulcan marksman defense. This is especially the case if you feel like you have a very bad setup or you made a wrong gamble, your units are on the outside of the board, then you can sometimes sell out of the side that you're not getting pushed on and use your credits to get a giant on the board, and kind of try and make a quick comeback into the game. Let's quickly just go to some games so that you can have a better idea of how these setups work, and see how this goes in practice. Alright, so here we are in a game 1 where I'm facing an opponent that started with steel balls and crawlers, and I am indeed facing a asymmetrical push setup. Now you can see that I have positioned most of my units here in the middle. My sledgehammers here are 2 squares to the inside of the tower, and they do extend 5 squares forward, so they will be pulling these units here from my opponent. This is kind of my round 1 setup, and it allows these tanks here to also travel towards my opponent and be able to help out. And then the second benefit is that if my opponent ever wants to kind of try and poke at my left tower, I will have these units right here that will pull them and be able to kind of defend the tower from an initial attack on that side of the board. If we then kind of move forward a little bit, you will see me expanding onto the right side of the board, because that's the side I'm getting pushed on. I have added this arc light here on the outside that will be able to deal with any shallow flank shenanigans that might show up. I have these Mustangs in this case to help out as well. And yeah, you can kind of see that my opponent here is trying to solidify his position on the right side, which is often how this early game tends to go. If we then move forward a little bit more, you will see that I have added things like those sledgehammers here as well onto the outside. You can see that some of them here do turn towards this deep flank that has been added. I have these Phoenixes added here as well. And the whole idea is that these units here are able to deal with the flank, then kind of transition, deal with the shallow flank and the push that is coming into this diagonal, right? And the sledgehammers in this scenario against this specific comp are really, really useful at slowing this down. Now, if you move further even more, you're going to see kind of the third development that usually happens in these type of aggro defenses, which is that your opponent tries to poke at your other tower if they happen to not be successful on the initial side they were pushing, right? So now they shift their attention to your left tower. Luckily, again, I had a basis of units there from the start. And I'm able to kind of repeat the process here where I have some stuff on the outside that can deal with any of these shallow flanks, these diagonal attacks, and I add some more units to that as well. We can then move on to the very final round of this specific game. And here you can kind of see how I positioned my units. Now this is kind of important, right? When you do position your early units, try and make sure that you leave some space for instance, giants. If you leave 4 spaces between your units, you're at least going to have enough to get some giants in there, because you might get them from free unit drops, or you might find yourself wanting to purchase them yourself to deal with a threat that has come onto the board, right? So here I decided to go for fortresses as kind of my final scaling unit. And you can see that it fits perfectly here between my sledgehammers. And this kind of just repeats the process, right, of what I've been talking about. You go into the middle, you then expand onto the board, onto the side of the board you're getting pushed. You make sure that you can deal with these shallow flanks and deep flanks, and then you make sure once you get pushed onto the other side that you have some units over there, and you repeat that process. Now here is a second game that I played, and this time around I'm facing tarantulas with crawlers. Again, here I am expecting an aggro push, and it does happen to be another asymmetrical push. And you can see me using this tactic here, where I have these vertical sledges to kind of protect my, well, the middle. Also, these units are able to rotate to the correct side of the board, and I'm using this fang pull here to make sure that all of the opponent's units are getting pulled towards my units instead of going for my tower instantly. I am a little bit more towards the outside here, but the two squares on the inside positioning is kind of the furthest you can go to the inside while still pulling the units. If you go more towards the outside, obviously the trick will still work. That is just something that is kind of up to preference. Now, here you're going to see kind of a similar trend, right? If I move forward, you can see that I will be expanding onto the left side of the board here, adding some sledges to be able to deal with this diagonal push and the eventual shallow flanks that will often show up. I'm making sure that I have enough here chaff clear, enough kind of front line tankiness, and I have this Farseer that I happen to pick up that is very good flank defense and anti-air defense. And then here I happen to have a melter as well for my main DPS source, basically. You can see that I will be moving here onto the left side, and my opponent is trying to expand their board onto the left. You can see that they start to prod at my right tower here as well, but I have a decent amount of units here to kind of stop that, and once I know that it's coming, I can then prepare myself the next round to be able to deal with it adequately. The main idea here is just to make sure that that type of push gets stopped at least a little bit. And then we can see the next round. Indeed, I am relatively comfortable in this scenario on the left side, so I can use the resources and the deployments onto the other side of the board to add a kind of similar defense situation here with this arc light that can deal with anything on the flank, at least in terms of chaff. I have this Farseer again, kind of an all-purpose chaff clear anti-air unit. And yeah, just trying to stop this advance and the different kind of cheese possibilities that you might be facing. We then move on to the final round. You can see that my board is now fully fledged. And I have managed to get basically everything I need, right? I have these frontline chaff units to kind of funnel in the enemy forces where I want to have them. I then have the sledgehammers as that second line of tanky defense that kind of stops the enemy units and holds them in place for long enough for my DPS units to take them out. And then I have these type of flank defense units that can deal with flanks, but then also have rotate right over to the main fight once they're done clearing this. And I want to show you a third game where I actually was the one playing aggro, but my opponent defended very, very well. And it also showcases a different starting comp where instead of having sledges to start with, the opponent started with Stormcallers, which are kind of seen as a pretty bad opener into steel balls. But my opponent here defends expertly. Now I am playing asymmetrical, symmetrical, excuse me here, but it kind of shows you that the concepts I've been explaining to you work for almost any aggro gameplay you might face. So again here my opponent is going to be on the inside, making sure that the units are able to deal with wherever the push is coming from. And that sets him up for the rounds afterwards, right? So if you move forward here a little bit, in this scenario, my opponent is developing their board in a symmetrical fashion, because that's also what I had been doing. So they're adding these marksmen here in the middle and on the outside. They're using the Farseer here on the outside to deal with any air pushes. And then if we move forward even more, sledges do get added in this case because my comp happens to be a Wraith, Steel Ball, and then even a Typhoon. And these are great units to stop that. And you can see a similar thing, right? He can deal with the flanks here. Some of the sledges on the outside here are able to turn towards a deep flank, while some of the front ones can still move forward and stop the advance. And then eventually these units will be able to join in once they have dealt with that crawler pack, right? Which doesn't take too long. And the same thing, honestly, on the other side of the board. And if we then move on to the very final round, you can see more sledges have been added. You have these outside arc lights here to be able to deal with any of the crawlers that might be on the flank. And this is just an extremely solid defense. I lost this in 7 rounds and my opponent barely took any damage, as you can see in the top right. So yeah, this kind of showcases that same idea, right? You start again in the middle of the board and then you expand towards the outside depending on where your opponent is. If it's asymmetrical, you're going to be expanding on that side of the board that you're getting pushed. If it's symmetrical, then you will probably have the agency and the breathing room to just expand symmetrically as well, because your opponent is doing the same. Let's now move on to a final game where I want to show a slightly different defensive comp, although it starts the same. And where I also kind of talk about these weaknesses, right, that we know about aggro, especially the fact that these towers are relatively open, and so are the flanks. So that's kind of what I want to be showcasing here. Again, you're going to see me starting in the middle. My opponent starts asymmetrical, has a Steel Ball, Arclight, Crawler opener. You will see me using this pull tactic here. I am in fact 2 squares on the inside in this scenario. This is the most inside I can be, which does guarantee to some extent that these units will be involved in the fight. And we can then kind of look at how this is going to progress. Let's go on to round 3 first. So what I do here, right, is my opponent obviously is kind of trying to add to their board, trying to solidify this push on the left side. What I am doing is trying to make sure that they don't forget about their weaknesses on the other side of the board. I'm here using a Wasp pack and a Crawler pack. This can't get missiled, right? Missile will only hit either ground units or air units. They can't hit both at the same time. So this prevents any missile from defending the tower, and this will allow me to get in and be able to get that 9-second tower debuff for myself, which will give me that advantage during the round and hopefully buy me some time to stabilize, because my opponent has kind of already showed their hand. All that I need is more resources, more deployments to be able to fully build the defense that I want. So here I'm kind of shifting his attention to, hey, you're going to need to do something about this because I am going to attack your towers just as much as you're attacking mine. And then if we go on to the next round, you can actually see that indeed I have managed to get some resources here out of him, right? So he's added a Wraith to that side, trying to deal with the Wasps, but I'm using Jump Drive to be able to move this around the map and kind of use the aggro tactics against the aggro player. I'm now shifting my attention to the flank and saying, you might have fixed this problem, right? You might have fixed this diagonal, but this one is still open. And if we go to the other side of the board, well, so is this diagonal, right? And this not only buys you time, because if you're successful, you get a debuff, it also means your opponent has to invest some of their resources in defending their own turrets. And that might mean having to use units all the way in the back where they won't be as useful, or they won't be able to join the rest of the army quite in time, right? So it makes their push weaker as well. This is something that you can definitely try in your own games. Don't just try and, you know, crawl into your shell and try to defend. Try and lash out as well, right? The best defense sometimes is offense, and in this case, your opponent has towers just like you do, and you can try and abuse that or make use of it. If you move on a couple rounds here, you can see that I was being really annoying, right? My opponent here decides to just upgrade the towers because he doesn't want to invest deployments into this backline, but I can still take down this tower even if it's level 2. Level 3 might be a little bit more difficult, but level 2 is certainly not a problem. It'll take a little bit longer, but I'll still get the debuff somewhere during the mid-round, right? Here you can see that I add a crawler. Again, that means that it can't defend with a single missile. And in the meanwhile, right, this doesn't really cost me all that many deployments. I can kind of reuse this wasp deployment thanks to jump drive, and I'm only using one crawler in this scenario to kind of strengthen my flank. But I still have all of my deployments left to create this board that I've been wanting to create, right? In this case, I've kind of managed to make it from a asymmetrical aggro into somewhat of a symmetrical aggro, and it also means that I get to expand in the way that I want. You again will see these sledges to the sides to be able to slow down the Wraith and the Steel Balls. And here I am deciding to leave always enough space for a giant such as Vulcan to be put down. This is a slightly different defense than from what you might have seen. Vulcan Marksman is also quite a potent defense against something like Wraith Steel Ball. But you need to have the resources to get a Vulcan. And again, it is really nice if you get or use at least the money from the free units, because you do run the risk of Steel Balls locking onto your Vulcan and it's only a single target. So if it goes down, then, you know, there goes all your chaff gear. But if you manage to get some levels, then it can be really, really strong. Let's move on to another round where you can see that my opponent is getting annoyed, right? Now he's trying to make use of some missiles here, and I'm moving onto the right side because I saw that he hadn't really been answering that. And then if we move on even further, at some point you will see me moving this back to the main army, where I'm trying to then abuse not just the diagonal in the back line or like this one, right? But I can also try and abuse these diagonals if I want to. And so it's all kind of about realizing that, yes, your opponent is putting pressure on you, but oftentimes they are giving up something for it, right? Oftentimes, somewhere on the map, they are going to have a certain weakness. Now, you might not always have the luxury or the time to be able to abuse that because your opponent is simply pushing in too quickly, right? You have to kind of calculate the fact that you do have a spawn-in time on the flanks, which slows you down. And sometimes you will find yourself too far behind to be able to use all the deployments on a cheese, because you simply need the deployments to even have a chance at contesting the fight where it is happening. But this gives you an idea at least of what is possible. Now, some final tricks I kind of want to talk about is, one, using spells, right? So on the right tower, you will find Sticky Oil Bomb for 150. This is a very, very strong spell against aggro, because generally speaking, they won't be able to shield it and it will slow them down for 2 turns. Or alternatively, it will burn their board, right? If you have something like a Vulcan or some Badgers to ignite the oil. They can't really shield it, so oftentimes you will find yourself putting it kind of on your side of the field, and it will make sure that you have a little bit more time in the early game, especially if you're like an enemy Steel Ball leveled early and you don't think you have the DPS. The oil can really help. So make sure that you use that, preferably even early on, because then it will come off cooldown later on in the game and you'll get multiple uses out of it. Another thing is, sometimes it is okay to use missiles. Don't overuse it, right? Make sure that you do have the money to get the units you want. But if something has kind of over-leveled or on the flank, like you don't really know how to deal with something, it's okay to sometimes just missile it, right? Same thing, it's okay to sometimes just fortify your tower. If you feel like your opponent has put too many resources on one side in a single round and you won't be able to defend that the next turn, sometimes the best thing for you to do is just to fortify the tower a couple levels, right? Level 3, maybe even level 4. If you have the money. That way it disincentivizes them from taking the tower, and the tower will, 1, give less debuff, and 2, it'll be tankier, so it'll take much longer for them to take it out. That's kind of something that you will have to learn to play with, kind of judge whether or not you have the resources to go for this type of symmetrical board, or whether or not your opponent has too much tempo and you just want to play on one side of the board and just fortify your tower. This is something that aggro players use a lot as well. you can see that my opponent here has leveled the towers, and the idea there is kind of to disincentivize me from going for those towers, right? And it also sometimes can just be cheaper than him having to use deployments where he'd rather use them on his strong side. So, I hope that this has helped. Again, just like with anything in Mechabellum, defending is going to become easier with more experience, but I hope that this is kind of giving you some tools and some tips and tricks to be able to make it a bit easier and to understand what you have to do, right? So 1, try and position on the inside on round 1. Try and use these pulling tactics that I have been explaining. Try and use these vertical units. Then expand onto the side you're getting attacked on. You can use some tricks, right? You can use the tower oil. You can use tower fortifications on your weak side. You can try and prod at your opponent's towers to get a debuff and get an early round win, just to buy you some time. You can use missiles. Try and use all of these tactics so that your opponent doesn't just steamroll you. Anyway, I hope that you liked this video. If you did, please leave a thumbs up. If I left anything out or you have some questions remaining, put them in the comments down below. I'll try and answer them as best I can. If you want to see me play live, please check me out on Twitch. And with that being said, I'm going to say take care and see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.